So historians and Smith family members have long believed that a daguerreotype of Joseph Smith Jr. was captured prior to his death. Joseph Smith III remembered his father as a kind and pleasant man and wanted to help preserve his father's memory by sharing family-held images of his father's visual appearance with the wider movement. Here you can see on this slide that we have put up is that there are many instances. This is just one example of either appearing in the newspaper or in publications where people have made statements that they believe that there were images of Joseph Smith that had been shot before his death. Okay. Emma Smith preserved and protected an oil portrait of Joseph painted in 1842 by David Rogers. Joseph III believed this painted image was an accurate representation of his father's appearance. Throughout his life, Joseph III tried to popularize this image among interested adherents of his father's faith. Okay. What is a daguerreotype? Well, the photographic process that has become the familiar process of shooting pictures today and capturing images was begun or invented by Louis Daguerre in 1839 in France. Then Samuel Morse introduced the process to New York City that very same year. A daguerreotype is a process of taking a piece of copper and polishing it and sensitizing the surface with silver and mercury vapor and then developing it. There's no photographic print made from it. The daguerreotype serves as both the negative and the positive, depending on how the light reflects from it. Okay? So when Samuel Morse introduced the photographic process in New York City, a member of the church by the name of Foster was very interested, began studying and also advertising about the process and helping Daguerrean artists sell their wares. Then this Lucian Foster was president of the New York City branch, also had an interest in what was going on in Nauvoo, and then visited Nauvoo and then eventually moved to Nauvoo, arriving on the 27th of April, 1844. Okay? Interested researchers have long anticipated that should an actual photographic image of Joseph exist, it must be somewhere in the hands of family members like Joseph and Emma's great and great-great-grandchildren, like the Larson family, or other branches of the family. Lois Larson, shown here with Dan, is also shown in 1939 laying a wreath on the grave of Emma Hale Smith in Nauvoo. After the death of Fred M. Smith, his wife Ruth Lyman Cobb passed away. Fred often asked his daughter Lois to function as the church ceremonial roles, such as pictured here, as the church's first lady. Okay? Indeed, various Smith family artifacts did end up in the Larsons' possession, including two watch-like artifacts. One was Joseph III's monogrammed pocket watch, and so we have a picture of that displayed on this slide. Next, the second is a watch-like object that could not be opened. Next, when Dan Larson finally got the artifact open, it proved to be a watch locket with the face of a man inside rather than the face of a watch. Here we see a picture of the interior of the watch locket with the image that Dan found inside. And then also we have shown on this slide the Rogers oil portrait of Joseph painted in Nauvoo in 1842 42 from Life, and see that we were immediately aware that there seemed to be some relationship. Next. When Dan Larson finally got, Dan's first impression was that it was a photographic image of Joseph Smith. However, for most of us, since the image of Joseph portrayed in the familiar oil portrait since the late 1800s had become the most accepted image of Joseph, found that there is a bit of perceptual adjustment necessary to recognize the face that appears in the watch locket as Joseph. We have some images here showing how Joseph III made an effort during his lifetime to popularize and share the family-owned image of the oil portrait. So in 1879, Joseph worked with some other church members to create what is known as the Carson image, and so we see that to the right in this slide. Next. Joseph III also obtained a daguerreotype of the oil portrait from Louis Bideman. You can see that in the center of this slide. In 1885, Joseph III went on a missionary trip to the West and stopped in Salt Lake City, where he met with a man named Charles W. Carter, who was a photographer, and he made the daguerreotype image of the oil portrait available to Charles Carter. And you can see on the right the print or the image that Charles Carter produced and then subsequently made available for sale among LDS. And Joseph III sometimes would refer our LDS church members to Charles Carter to acquire images as well. Next.
Let's talk a little bit about the object itself, or the artifact itself. These objects are sometimes called watch lockets, probably for obvious reasons. They look from the outside when closed just like a pocket watch, but they're not. In this case, they hold Daguerrean images, so none of the images on the screen are the Larson watch locket, but some of them have very similar scenes engraved on the front and similar engravings on the back as well. So watch lockets. They were advertising in The Prophet, a church newspaper in New York City in May of 1844. Lessons, daguerreotypes, apparatus, chemicals, plates, cases, etc., including gold-plated lockets available from $3 to $5.50 each. You could also have them tinted or colored for a little extra, 25 to 50 cents extra. So these objects are available and being advertised in a church newspaper by May of 1844.
Doc, your voice is being a little distorted. Maybe you could say it just a little farther away from the microphone.
Any better?
I think so. Let's just give it a try.
Great. You see here an image of our friends from the Church of Jesus Christ, kind enough to do XRF. I don't even want to try and pronounce it, but analyzing the material that the watch locket is made of. And it is 45% silver, 34% gold, and 20% copper. Our first thought was that we should have it disassembled in the hopes that we would find a name or a date or maker's marks inside. It was extraordinarily difficult to find somebody to work with us early on, because this was March and April of 2020, maybe into May, and everything was locked down early on. But through the help of a friend who works at the Nelson Art Gallery in Kansas City, she connected me with the Nelson curator, who connected me with a curator in the Kansas City area with significant expertise in daguerreotypes. He connected us with somebody who worked with miniatures, and together they were able, with Dan and Rose there, to disassemble the watch locket. Unfortunately, there were no maker's marks, dates, or identifying notes inside. was discovered that this is a 16th plate daguerreotype cut or trimmed in a circular form to fit inside the locket, and it has a circular glass cover on the top. And the plate itself is consistent with those manufactured in the mid-1840s. We also wanted to try and better understand not just the artifact, but the image it contained. So we reached out to Grant Romer, who is one of the world's experts on archaic imaging. He's now retired, but worked with the Eastman House, Kodak's museum in Rochester. We've had the chance to work with Grant off and on over the last 30 years. He was kind enough to look at the image for us. He concluded that the earliest he would date it, meaning the image, would be 1843, which he believed would be the opinion of others as well. We looked at things like hairstyle, which is consistent with the 1840s. We looked at things like the coat and the shirt collar and the neck cloth, which are consistent with the 1840s. Occasionally people push back on the black tie. Joseph is more often seen wearing white neckwear, but we know that he owned at least one black satin stock, a gift from an English convert in 1842. And we know that Sutcliffe Maudsley illustrated Joseph and Hiram and other church leaders in black neckcloths in the 1840s. And William Major paints 5 of the 8 church leaders together in one painting, in an 1840s painting, in dark neckcloths. So it was understood apparently to be appropriate for religious leaders to wear not just white, but black and other dark colors as well. We realized at some point that when the watch locket was disassembled, the daguerreotype, the round daguerreotype it contained, looked very much like a circa 1844 Lucy Mack Smith daguerreotype founded in the early 1990s in Lynn and Lorene Smith's attic. Lynn Smith, the son of Albert A. Smith, the son of David H. Smith. This object was in a trunk upstairs in the attic, in an envelope labeled Mother Smith's Pictures. In this context, that was Clara Hartshorn Smith, David Smith's wife, again, Joseph and Emma's youngest son. This was a carte de visite, so a little rectangular photograph, but a photograph of an earlier Daguerrean object. At the time, we thought it was a button, but we now realize it's a locket insert. So that suggests that the Smith family had access to this technology by the mid-1840s in Nauvoo, and they were using this technology. There's a painting based on this daguerreotype, we believe hanging in the Nauvoo Temple by December of 46. So it gives us some idea of when it would have been available. Also really important is the provenance, or the history of ownership of the object and the items that it is stored with through the years. And this is where Kristen and Rosemarie and Rachel were extraordinarily helpful. We began looking at every early Smith family member we could find, and started to see on some of the women what appears to be the watch locket hanging up from a chain. This is Bertha Madison Smith, the daughter-in-law of M.S. Smith Bideman, circa 1869. And then a detail. This one is not great detail. The rectangular object you see just above the locket on the chain, I believe to be a pin. That pin would attach the chain and the locket to your dress. So when you leaned over, it wouldn't be swinging around. Here it is again, and this is the first one. Krista noticed this first. This is circa 1875. Emma Josepha Smith McCallum, and she's, of course, the namesake of both Emma and Joseph. She is Joseph III's oldest child, Joseph and Emma's oldest grandchild. Emma J., as she is known, was also given by Emma before her wedding the gold bead necklace that Emma Hale Smith is often seen wearing in images. And you see a detail of that image with Ron superimposed the Smith-Larson watch locket next to this image, and we believe that to be the same object.
One little element that I will just contribute is that these pictures of Smith women wearing what appears to be the artifact seem to be associated with weddings. So at the time of Emma Josepha's wedding in 1875, the artifact was made available to her to wear, And then perhaps Locke will mention some others that wore, but it's usually, not always, but usually associated with weddings.
Here she is again, circa 1879. This one has a little better detail, and you can also see the pin that's attaching it, I think, to the dress. This was Ron's attempt to capture some of the detail. And we believe that we can see similar elements like the scrolling on the bottom right, some of the shoreline features, some of the buildings, and the hill top left. So we, of course, wish that we could pull more detail out of these images, but they are photographs of the women versus photographs focusing intently on the locket. So we pulled out as much detail as we could, and we believe these to be the same object. Here again, she is late in life, Emma J, with her sister Carrie, and by this time Carrie seems to have the bead necklace that was apparently Emma Hale Smith, so either given to her or loaned to her by her sister Emma J. Emma J has moved the watch locket to a thin chain by 1910. Does show up on a few other Smith women during this time, also on a thin chain. We think it is. It's hard to get enough detail on some of those later images. Also, if you get the chance, look at Stephen Buell's Sutcliffe Maudsley, Nauvoo Profilist. Plate 18 in this book is Emma with Alexander, her son, and there is an object around her neck on a ribbon, partially projecting from a pocket in her dress, that is either a watch or a watch locket. We're not able to tell for sure, but Emma is described at her wedding to Louis Bideman as wearing a watch on a chain, which of course, when closed, you can't tell the difference between a watch and a watch locket. So this is just speculation, but it's fun to think that Emma might have been wearing a daguerreotype of Joseph as she married Louis on Joseph's birthday. Just a little help with the context and the provenance. So this is a Joseph Smith III family reunion, 1912. Joseph III is in the second row with the white beard and cane. His oldest daughter, Emma J, sits to his right. Son, Fred M, is in the third row, fifth from left. These, of course, marked with the red circles. And Fred's daughter, Fred M's daughter, or Dan Larson's mother, Lois, sits at the feet of her grandfather, Joseph Smith III, and at the feet of her aunt, Emma J.
After we began working with the image, we realized that there needed to be some methodologies adopted that would allow us to understand the artifact better. So one methodology was subjective facial analysis. And subjective, in this sense, means that it's based on individual personal feelings, tastes, opinions, or knowledges. And so subjective analysis is not without its perils, because we all have biases, and when we look at something subjectively, sometimes our biases color our thoughts. So you can still try to be as unbiased as possible, but that's one of the potential pitfalls.
The same in an Emma daguerreotype and portrait comparison later.
So I think that was considered to be a sign of someone who is considered to be handsome or attractive. Women kept the sun off their face because they didn't want to look tan or dried up. So we can see that in this case, I've heard it said that the reason that portrait artists painted their subjects this way was that it was easier to sell the portrait and get paid the prettier that you made the subject look. So let's go to the next one. So here we have, again, another Michael Street overlay this is the, let's see, I'm struggling with what he's overlaid here. He's overlaid the, what is it, Locke? It's the portrait and the...
It's the daguerreotype on top of the portrait.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to the next one. This is another way that he could compare images by measuring the distance between some features that were fixed in the face or tended not to vary too much. So again, we see a pretty good positive relationship between the image and the death mask, and less so there with the tip of the nose in the oil portrait. Let's go to the next one. And here Strede did tracings. He did tracings of the image and then laid them onto a death mask and also onto the oil portrait. And those are also quite close. One point probably just to mention is that when comparing images like this, you have to make sure that they're from about the same level so that there's not distortion or foreshortening in the image if it was shot from below or from the side. All right, let's go ahead to the next one. Here we have the image from the watch locket compared with the death mask. And again, you see some interesting relationships there. So Strede went on to say that he concluded that there was a high likelihood that the three images are the same person. Converting highly likely to a percentile scale, he noted that it would be, in his opinion, about a 90% probability that the photos are all of the same person. So let's go to the next image. So here we just, again, have a little larger image comparison for you to look at. And then these two slides have picked out some facial features and highlighted where they appear to be present in both the image, the Smith daguerreotype, and the oil portrait. So it's interesting that the oil, that David Rogers included some of those details in the oil portrait. So let's go to the next slide. So this is one more of those features. You see there's a distinctive frown line both in the portrait and in the Smith Larson daguerreotype. And we believe that it's also present in the death mask, although the death mask has been copied many times, and some of the features like this have been decreased over those various times that it's been copied. It just gets fainter and fainter. All right, Lon, let's go to the next slide.
So we also wanted to do some objectives to who would work with us. Most facial recognition software companies are massive. They're doing Defense Department work and law enforcement work, and they're not particularly interested in looking at old photographs. But Animetrics was willing to work with us out of New Hampshire. So we supplied them with a number of images, the daguerreotype image of the death mask from a copy that I have, the originals, of course, in the collections of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And then from Community Christ, the Rogers oil portrait. They did a few things, just like the split screen stuff, kind of like what Strede did, comparing daguerreotype to death mask, comparing daguerreotype to portrait. They digitized 21 points on the images And based on the objective methodologies of Animetrics, they concluded that there is moderate evidence the portrait and mask images are of the same person in the daguerreotype, with moderate being considered a positive outcome in the discipline of facial comparison. Comparing the daguerreotype and oil portrait images, 19 of 21 features fell within the 95% confidence interval, and almost all measurements taken from the portrait and mask photos fall within the range of 95% confidence interval of measurements taken from the daguerreotype image. So we thought that was promising. It's one piece of the puzzle.
So we've selected some quotes from some early church members that talk about Joseph's oil portrait. So let's go ahead to the next slide. So Junius Wells was involved, I think, with the LDS Church educational system, and he traveled around some. In the lifetime of Emma, he stopped and visited her in Nauvoo. You may be aware that Emma kept the oil portrait of Joseph in her bedroom in the Nauvoo Mansion house. And so Junius Wells visited, and while he was there, Emma showed him the portrait. Junius Wells asked Emma if it was a good likeness of Joseph, and she replied that Joseph could not get a good portrait. His countenance was changing all the time. Let's go to the next one. Wells asked Emma, pressed a little bit further, and asked what Joseph thought of the oil portrait. And so it's kind of nice. It confirms that the oil portrait was painted during Joseph's lifetime. Emma said that Joseph replied that Joseph told her that he thought the painting made him look like a silly boy and doesn't look much like a prophet of the Lord. So it shows that while there are many interesting features that appear to be captured from Joseph's facial visage, the overall way that it was put together wasn't all that pleasing to Joseph. So let's see, let's go. Here we have Parley Pratt talking about Joseph's unique eyes. And Parley says there was something special, connected and serene with his serene and steady penetrating glance of his eye, as if he would penetrate the deepest abyss of the human heart, gazing into eternity, penetrate the heavens, and comprehend all worlds. So here you can give you the chance to be subjective analysts, and you can determine for yourselves whether you think this individual in this daguerreotype has eyes that perhaps could be described as Parley Pratt described them. Let's go to the next one. So here is Lydia Knight. She was an early church member, lived in Kirtland during the Kirtland period. And she said Joseph had eyes that seemed to dive down to the innermost thoughts with their sharp, penetrating gaze. And so again, she was thought there was something unique or special about the appearance of Joseph's eyes. We'll go to the next one. This is by Gilbert Belknap. He lived here in Jackson County during the early church period. I was introduced to the prophet, whose mild and penetrating glance denoted great depth of thought and extensive forethought. While standing before his penetrating gaze, he seemed to read the very recesses of my heart. All right, let's go ahead to the summaries.
So I'm back to an unstable connection, so we'll see if we make it through. So in summary.
So like was going to say that well, I've lost the slide. Only Locke had the slides. So
It looks
I
like Locke is back.
I can't talk about the slides because I don't have them in front of me.
Are we good again?
Yeah, we're good.
Great. In summary, his family and scholars suspected it would, the daguerreotype emerged from among the descendants of Joseph Smith III. Lucian Foster is the best candidate for creating the image, having arrived in Nauvoo 2 months prior to Joseph's death. Foster came from New York City, where advertisements in the church newspaper offered daguerrean instructions, equipment, and accessories, including gold-plated lockets. Characteristics are consistent with daguerreotypes made in the mid-1840s. The Lucy Mack Smith image demonstrates that technology and skill sets needed to create locket inserts were available in Nauvoo and being utilized by the Smith family. The hairstyle and clothing, including the neckcloth, are consistent with the 1840s. An artist with more than 4 decades of experience in law enforcement forensic facial imaging determined that there was a 90% probability that the death mask, portrait, and Smith-Larsen daguerreotype were the same person. Mathematical formulas used in facial recognition algorithms recognized a positive relationship between the portrait, death mask, and the Smith-Larsen daguerreotype. There are significant similarities between the oil portrait and daguerreotype, including hairline and style, shape of the face and nose, and features of the mouth, cheek, and eyelids. The distinctive frown line is perhaps most striking. There is a compelling provenance in the Smith family. Joseph Smith III understood that Lucian Foster created a daguerreotype of his father. Prominent Smith women are seemingly wearing the locket over 3 generations. Both objective and subjective investigative approaches have convinced us that the Smith-Larsen daguerreotype is Joseph Smith, Jr. Back to Ron.
So the visual image of Joseph Smith has come to light, is what Locke and I have concluded in our article in the John Whitmore Journal, and encourage everyone who's interested in obtaining a copy of our research and explore that for yourself. Here we have the picture of an individual that's quite compelling in a song that the LDS saints sing, Praise to the Man. They've been singing it since the late 19th century. The LDS have been proclaiming that millions will know Brother Joseph again, and perhaps this image will help fulfill Brother Phelps' prophecy. For many of those who may not recognize Joseph in this image, I say be thoughtful of what you ask for in your favorite hymns.
Just a few comments on some of the responses. Of course, there was initially lots of it's him or it's not him. And as we're making our way through that, past that, we're now starting to get some thoughtful questions and concerns raised. Ron has had some really interesting thoughts on the slow evolution of Joseph's image, how we perceive Joseph. And it's clear that until 1885, most of the folks in the West, if not all of them, only knew Joseph, for the most part, from profile images based on Sutcliffe Maudsley, on Maudsley's work. So we only knew Joseph through these profiles for much of the 19th century. But because of intentional efforts on Joseph Smith III's part in creating the 1879 Carson image and the 1885 Carter image, making it available to Charles W. Carter, the front view slowly began to become more and more popular. But even then, it took generations, because it takes a while to shift your understandings. If you imprint on a particular image, it takes a while to do the kind of the rewiring. So it's only been since the 1990s that our friends in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints have really embraced the David Rogers portrait and began to use it much more frequently in their resources and make it available. So it's fascinating to watch kind of the slow evolution of how we perceive the visual image of Joseph. There was initially lots of pushback saying it's Hiram. Well, I'm thrilled that people recognize that it's a Smith, but I'm slightly puzzled that people think it's Hiram for a couple of reasons. In both the images I know of Hiram from life, an 1836 Kirtland portrait, and a circa maybe 42 Sutcliffe Maudsley image of Hiram, he has major sideburns. I know of no image of Hiram from the 18th century that does not feature significant sideburns on Hiram. Some people have commented on the chin. Just a word of warning that the Hiram death mask, the Dibble mask anyway, was damaged at some point, and the chin has been replaced. So it may or may not be similar to the pedestal Hiram mask. We need to look at that, but be careful about focusing too much on the chin. A number of people think it's too old, the Smith-Larsen daguerreotype, too old to be Joseph. Again, a word of caution that much of what people perceive of as wrinkles, especially on the forehead, are scratches on the glass cover from polishing it in a circular fashion. So they do look very much like wrinkles on the forehead, but they're scratches on the glass. There's also what some people have perceived as a scar, not the brow furrow or the frown line, but a scar coming down through the eyebrow. That's also scratches on the glass. It's also clear, though, that the portrait artist, like others at the time, would make you look younger. And I think this example of Emma Hale Smith, David Rogers' 1842 portrait, compared to a daguerreotype of Emma circa 1845, also shows that portraits at the time tended to make you look younger. Yes, it's true that Emma had been through a stressful few years between these two images. It's also true that Joseph had been through a stressful few years between his portrait and the daguerreotype. I thought a really good point raised was that if the Smith family had this daguerreotype of Joseph and knew it, they would have been much more public about it. And that people like Fred M. Smith, seen here, would certainly have used it against, as a tool, as a weapon against his cousins in Utah as they began battling between the churches. That is a pretty good point. But if you read the paper carefully, and I had not initially thought this through, and we didn't talk about this in the paper, we talked about things like Emma was very protective of Joseph's image and was worried about it being connected to polygamy, so would not make the copies of the portrait available, kept it in her room, not in public spaces. But I think an even more important point is the Smith family, I think, wouldn't necessarily have been trumpeting the existence of this daguerreotype because they had already shared with the world what they believed to be a daguerreotype of Joseph. When Joseph Smith III took a daguerreotype to Utah in 1885, both Joseph III and Carter thought that image was a daguerreotype from life. And that understanding continued for decades. C. Ed Miller, the RLDS Church's graphics person, photography person, reported to the 1947 RLDS General Conference that we have actual photographs of Joseph Smith and Emma Smith in daguerreotype. Well, we know without question that those are daguerreotypes of the oil portrait. And Israel A. Smith, likely influenced by C. Ed Miller and maybe by Fred M., said, we have a daguerreotypes of both grandfather and grandmother that suggest perhaps the paintings were made from them or vice versa. He was starting to wonder by that time. But the Smith family already believed that they had shared with the world a daguerreotype of Joseph Smith Jr. from life beginning in 1885. So this would have been just another image of Joseph. Again, it turns out they were mistaken. What they had shared in 1885 was a daguerreotype of the oil portrait. And the paper goes into details on how that misunderstanding could occur. There are some additional things that we're already starting to work on. We now realize we need to know a lot more about 19th century portraiture. We've had a number of art historians weigh in and explain that the changes we see between the Joseph and Emma portraits and their photographs from the period are the kinds of changes that portrait artists made at that time. Again, longer noses, thinner lips, smaller mouths, smoother skin, straighter hair, trying to make you look more refined. We also need to do some work tracking down David Rogers' portraits, other portraits. Glenn Leonard found some in New York and in Washington, D.C. We need to track those down again and then try and find photographic images of the same people. And I believe that we're going to see the same differences that we see between the Joseph and Emma portraits and their daguerreotypes, but that's more research to be done. We're also working on learning even more about Lucian Foster.